Witam.
Good evening. Well, I just said welcome. I should have said good evening, but I don't know what to say since this is an online transmission. If I say good evening, internet will remember that it's an evening and maybe other people will want to have a different time of the day. So welcome. I would like to welcome my speaker, great Polish poet, Adamem Zagajewskim. My name is Jarosław Gugała. I'm a journalist. On daily basis, I'm involved in other issues, and I am not lucky enough to act in different areas, but today I'm very lucky and I'm very happy that I can have this discussion with Adamem Zagajewski. So I would like to talk about freedom and truth, about these two unique values and categories that we need. However, they are very difficult to keep. When I was getting ready for this discussion with you, Adam, the first thing I read was the information that you were born in Lviv. I was very happy because my mother's family is from Lviv. Then I found a poem when you mentioned your grandfather, Karol. Then I was even more moved, and I felt strongly connected with you because my grandfather, Stanisław, he was also from Lviv and he was also a teacher. And just like your grandfather, he had to leave, escape from Lviv. My granddad left Lviv very quickly because once he completed the school for teachers, he was ordered to work in schools which use Russian language. And he was working in Wołyń. And then he moved out to the other bank of the Bug River. So I read in your poem that Lviv is everywhere. So do you think that everyone should carry these places that are very special for us? Can we get rid of the Lviv? Can we leave for another modern, wonderful place? Can we stop carrying the Lviv in our hearts? Is this possible? I think that this is a privilege to have such secret places in our memory. I am sorry for people who spend their whole life in the place where they were born or somewhere in the neighborhood. The moment of departure, I do not remember that moment because I was a baby, but that moment was very tragic for my family. And potentially it was tragic to me too. But I know that there is this mysterious place, the place I don't know, but it is the foundation for my life, for my existence. So this is a gift. We are not... I never was tempted to expect that some borders should be changed. It's just the private borders of our imagination, our memory. A poem. One of the poem has two titles. It's called a course.
Mógłby pan go przeczytać?
Could you please read this poem? Okay. I feel like the pilot Perks wearing this headset, but I can't remember whether that pilot was a poet. You haven't known him? He lived in Kraków. Well, he lived near Kraków. Okay, I'm going to read the poem. The Latch. My grandfather was delivering a course in German in the Lviv University at 8 a.m. Many students were late. Granddad Karol, he loved discipline, and he put a latch on the door, and a few minutes after 8, the classroom was hermetically locked. And they were asleep. They slept for a long time. They slept luckily, and they didn't know that the city would stop existing, including the latch, that everything will come to an end, that they will be taken away, they will be executed, and they will be crying. And that the latch once will become an idyllic memory, a brooch, a treasury. You lived in many places. You could become familiar with the taste of emigration. You lived abroad, too. Polish poet. Can a Polish poet live abroad? Well, I think that the Polish poet should live abroad. The key Polish poet, Mickiewicz, Słowacki, and Miłosz, they used to live in other countries. They emigrated. Only Miłosz came back to Poland. It's very interesting that for a Polish poet, I should also include Gombrowicz. This list is quite long. So emigration for Polish writers is a major challenge. It is difficult, but ultimately it becomes very beneficial. It takes the poets away from a boring daily life. The life which for us is quite difficult. So they can change their perspectives. Sometimes this perspective becomes more philosophical, metaphysical, although our great poets have wrote a lot about Poland. They never forgot Poland, so this metaphysical aspect never interfered with the Polish subjects. Herbert wrote, a dench where grey water flows is called Vistula, and this is our fatherland. So he was really he was regretting. So what's the real fatherland of poets? Is this the language? Is this the language where poets meet and live? Poets who emigrated, and poets who create such poetry as yours, have they managed to undergo the transformation between the languages, between Polish and foreign languages? If I were to translate your poems, I am a linguist. I think that your poems are quite easy to translate into other languages. You are not using means or words that would be very difficult to recreate, that would be neologisms, that would be that would be a special language created by you, by your imagination. You probably don't know him, because nobody knows him in Poland, Horacio Ferrer from Uruguay. He wrote many poems. He cooperated with Piazzolla. I translated a a drama by him, and he has used many words he invented himself. So I had to follow his path. I had to touch these words and search for some translations. I had to create my own words that would be similar to his words. And that was difficult. It was like Chinese whispers. And I can see that you are attached to the idea that the language should be very clear, very simple. And by this, actually to make your poems translatable. What is your attitude? Do you have this, are you painfully attached to Polish language, or whether the language of your poetry is the language which is of a more universal nature? I'm really attached to Polish language, but not painfully attached, rather joyfully attached. I like Polish. I was also writing some essays, some sketches in English, in German. So theoretically, I could try to write poems in other languages. Maybe there are 2 or 3 poems in English, but I'm not tempted by this. You are talking about neologisms. In the Polish poetry, they are quite rare. Leśmian, Białoszewski, and several other poets are using avant-garde poems are using neologisms. But the mainstream poetry is not using neologisms. So I like such straightforward structures. I prefer that the imagination is complicated. The simple language should send us to complex and difficult topics, to metaphors. They should be complex, not the language itself. In 1968, when the Teraz, now a group of poets was established, the March 1968 incidents influenced establishment of this group. So you were declaring that the language should become more authentic. It should be true again. It should be rooted in daily life. Because you thought that only this kind of the language should be able to impact the reality. In 1968, what kind of motives did you have? The new communist language that was binding at the time? Was it your motivation? Well, the main motivation was strong feeling that we live in a country which has no freedom, which is ruled by lies. Using it, the new speech was a step 2. The first step, the key step, was resistance towards this common taking away freedom. The only exception was Tygodnik Powszechny, daily. So mainly the main archipelagos of Polish was fake. And March, if I remember well, but I remember this time very well, March 1968 has dramatized it even more. It was an explosion of lies. An explosion of attacks, beating up students. It was a question of Dziady by Mickiewicz. It was a lens which focused the basic features of this time. March 1968, for some reasons, reminds me, although I was a child at the time, So it reminds me, well, martial law and solidarity movement. Solidarity Carnival of 1980-1981 is the landmark for me. But when I think of 1968, it reminds me of the situation in Poland now. It used to be the engagement, the involvement of young people who want to have the truth, who question some fake, false pictures, manifestation of the reality, and they want something new. Sometimes we don't know what they really want, but this is evident resistance towards the reality, just as it used to be in 1968. At least the situation was like that in France. We had this atmosphere in Poland at the time, so young people wanted to take us to a better world. How do you perceive this? Can we identify some similarities between 1968 and Poland 2020?
No to jest bardzo rozległy temat.
This is quite a broad topic. I think we should stick to March 68 in Poland because the French one was different and it was also different in the United States. I think that one of the differences is between the current demonstrations and those ones. And I'm very happy that the young generation decided to say something, and I don't feel offended by the language they use. However, in 1968, students' demonstrations were undermining the essence of the communist system, and the country was shaken. It was trembling. It was a dramatic change. Nowadays, we can see some demonstrations, people dancing in the streets, and it's really nice to look at it. But some new topics have emerged. This is a democratic country. This is the country which has been hurt by Laurent justice. So new topics, new issues emerge. There have been manifestations and they will certainly come back, but this is not a major shake for the ship of our state. It is somehow accepted. Back then, it was a scandal. You must not do such things in communism. Nowadays, we have manifestations, and it's nice. 3 days ago, the criminals were setting Warsaw on fire. In a few days' time, we'll have a completely different topic. There is no opportunity that it's going to become an experience, a multi-generation experience. Well, it's up to these nice young people. They have to be persistent. They must not be satisfied with what they have done. My imagination is not able to capture it. However, what I know is that they need to persevere. They need to carry on. They need to be persistent in a long-term perspective. Well, this is like an awakening of the new generation that has not been present in the Polish social and political life. This is a generation which is quite peculiar. What do you think? Is this a generation that is going to start reading poetry again? Well, I don't know. This is a million zloty question. Do you believe, do you think they are going to read poems? They will try to find the truth in poetry? They will try to find freedom in poetry? It's hard to say it directly, but honestly speaking, I don't think so. For me, the truth remains an important value and central value. I believe they should have their own poets. They should not rely on earthly men and women. They should read, write, and think themselves. They should develop their own culture of their own generation. Somebody like me, when you are so many years old, you're not only looking for political topics. It's not only about civics, but answering the questions whether there is a mystery in our life. I don't want to enumerate it because we are talking about more political topic. It might sound ridiculous if I mention these serious aspects, but I like them. Not only the topics related to the society, to citizens. This is the rule in the life of poets who started with a very strong quasi-political reaction that later on they turn towards personal notes, philosophy, religion, because life is very interesting. It has lots of aspects, but the civil aspect is essential, is the key. Let me read your poem now, please. Butchers. An African, not a Negro. You can't hear about the Negroes who died in mines. These are African workers with smashed skulls. You can't hear of a butcher, the old night of the blood. Butchers are the museums of new sensitivity. A clerk. You cannot hear about the dog catcher that children hated.
Mogę pomóc.
I could help you. Do you remember? But some things no longer happen. The blood in the streets, on the car bonnets and on cars without bonnets. A person who is white because being so scared. A person facing death face to face. Somebody losing the life is what you hear. You do not hear about the death. I say it and I can see that my lips are lined with cardboard that was called remaining silent in the past. This is a beautiful poem about degradation, about separating the language from the categories that we try to talk about. Freedom, truth. How easily you can lead to a situation when the language is helpless and not able to express what we see. It becomes a kind of a mask or official non-emotional report to pay tribute to statistics, to satisfy the statistics, but not to awake any emotions. What is happening nowadays with the plethora of the media, of the sources that attack us with sounds, words, poems, doesn't it all lead to a situation you described in your poem that will be all covered with a substance that will resemble being lined with cardboard that will mute us. I think it's a complex issue because the word death and to die in all the languages I know is substituted with synonyms. Modern people living in convenient society rejects some final issues. Poetry can be of assistance because poetry cannot turn its back to the final issues, to the ultimate issues. The rule of law is an example of such term. It turns out that if the European Union wants to investigate the rule of law, our government does not accept it. It's strange because it seems that the rule of law is something nice and we should let them do it. But the rule of law has changed its meaning. It's not what Professor Zoll has mentioned, but this is what the Deputy Ministers of Justice claim. The new situation in which judges use their independence and prosecutors have lost it a long time ago. So these are the two dimensions, the political and philosophical one. And commercial. You say that something like that is happening in democracy, that we are trying to avoid the words referring to final issues, but perhaps we should attribute it to commercial aspects that we want to consume. We don't feel like being injured with words. We want to live conveniently, comfortably, and we don't need words to feel anguish. We are surrounded by sounds and it helps us avoid the truth hidden in silence. We are afraid of it. Can a poet be afraid of silence? There are different types of silences. There is preparatory silence, a silence which is not void. I think that every poet knows the bad silence, when nothing comes to your mind, when the fertile imagination or the inner life remains silent. And this is quite a negative thing. Have you ever experienced that? Yes, I have. And I'm quite familiar with it. You tend to be a poet. You are a poet occasionally, as Norvid said. There are some moments of creative imagination, or there are some series of moments, and you have to learn to live with that. But coming back to commercialization, that's true, but I don't know if it fits the topic of our discussion. We live in a post-religious world. The Poles go to church, but in my opinion, they go there automatically. They know they have to put their foot in church once a week, but this is no longer a religious act. We live in the post-religious world, and in order to think about death, I don't like thinking about death. I don't think death is an interesting topic. But in order to think about death and have a religious perspective and to fit the death in a broader perspective, I think that some priests do not have it at all.
Dominującą grupą ludzi
it seems that people who mainly go to church in Poland are the so-called people who do not believe, but they want to practice the religion. So this is quite customary. These are just like reflexes. Let's talk about God, about religion for a while. God, in one form or another, does exist, either as a creator, our creator, or something that we have created. We have created poetry because we were unable to express some things in any other way. So we created the God to silence our fears, our existential pain, as some philosophers say. In Poland, and it's very special for Kraków, in Poland, the church that used to be priest Tischner's, Tygodnik Powszechny weekly church, the church of Karol Wojtyła and many other people. This church has lost the battle. That this church, the fall of the church in Poland has resulted in the situation that the Polish intelligentsia gave up. It's withdrawn. Polish intelligentsia have become anti-clerical. They become atheists. So to them, the church is just about rituals. And they cannot meet the real faith in churches. So we've lost it. And now we are also witnessing some church-related affairs, scandals. So this cathedral of faith that is accessible to sensitive people, educated people, this cathedral is falling down, and in a moment we will have the landscape like Warsaw Muranów, where the Jewish ghetto used to be. So it will be Muranów, which has been reconstructed on the ruins of the ghetto. Aren't you afraid of this situation? Maybe you are more optimistic than myself. We are witnessing the twilight of the church that quite recently was very strong, was really very useful to poets, to intelligentsia, and now it has been all lost. Well, I have to agree with you. You are saying we do not know how many people truly believe, deeply believe. I think that there are people like this. Nobody can count them, but we cannot assume that the faith, deep, true faith, has disappeared. But we can say, when you are saying that the church during communist time, it was a beautiful church of Turowicz, Tischner, it was an open church that condemned Polish anti-Semitism, the church that was looking for another new formula. Karol Wojtyła was a member of this church, and this church has disappeared. Now we have quite a dreadful nationalist church. I think that our archbishop do not believe in God, they believe in the Polish nation. Nationalism has replaced the idea of Christianity, openness towards another person. The nation in Christianity is quite distant when we are looking at the hierarchy. The present Catholicism is nationalism. It's the end of a certain flame, Christian flame, which stayed in Poland for such a long time. The lack of universalism results in the situation that we are unable to notice our brothers and sisters in immigrants. So If Jesus Christ came to Poland as a refugee, we wouldn't let him in. That's true. The problem of immigrants is very complex. I agree with you. It's also a huge problem for Europe. And we have only 10 minutes left, so we won't be able to resolve. But we also do not we do not see victims. The church doesn't acknowledge that people who have been the victims of pedophiles are victims. So the church is only interested in the cash it is earning. It's taking care of its own dignity and ignores the fact that the people who have been hurt by the church are our brothers and sisters. These people for many years have been requesting to recognize the crime they have suffered. Let's leave it, because we do not have enough time. We have already mentioned many painful things. Let's get back to poetry, which is a kind of a church. The act of creation is a type of a service, church service. This is when usually a lonely person is talking about the key values, the basic values. So I wanted to ask you about your favorite poets. What are you looking for in poetry? What is of top value for you in the perspective of your own poetry? Concerning your decision on choices, for instance, choices of the language you have been using in your poems. Of course, this language has been changing, but what is most valuable to you? Are you fascinated by poets who are completely different from you, who try to reach the greatest values following a different path? So you have asked two questions. My favorite poets. Well, it's a long list, but I will start. My generation has been in the situation where our predecessors, Miłosz, Szymborska, they were well known throughout the world, and they have revolutionized the Polish poetry. They were highlighting both universal values, but they were also focused on the situation in Poland. So it was a kind of a magical approach where they were fascinated with the universal global culture. Just like Agnes in Russia was saying that it was the missing for the word culture. It was missing the universal culture. So they were missing this universalism, but at the same time they were focused on the local themes, that were taking place in Russia, and they were very successful. They are poets well known all over the world. Not many people talk about this. I'm talking about the great Polish poets. Miłosz, Herbert, Szymborska, Aleksander Wad. I don't want to say etc. because it's not so nice. Well, in my opinion, Polish culture has been noticed by the world thanks to these poets. Of course, I have to mention Andrzej Wajda, or great composers. We do not realize that the world perceived our culture in the provincial context. Not many people in Poland remember this or even know this. So it's not for me to remind us of this, but I have reminded. I think that these great poets have not been recognized enough. People start forgetting them. The Soviet occupation stopped long time ago, so people started forgetting those poets. What I'm searching for in poetry? Well, this is a difficult question. But let's try to answer this question. I had to ask you about this. If I hadn't asked, I would have regretted, and other people would be telling me that I should have asked. Just like the predecessors. I am really keen on this connection between the local aspect and the global aspect. I am focused on the visible, real world. The poetry of our times is very concrete. It cannot be too general. It has to be very concrete and specific. But there is also infinity. We do not quite know what infinity is. Kołakowski was writing about Spinoza, and he declared that Spinoza discovered freedom because in his thinking he was in touch with infinity. I'm not Spinoza, I'm not Kołakowski, but this is a great statement. To discover an infinity in the world, it provides us with some internal freedom, and it makes us distant. I do not have to think about Minister Ziobro every day. I have much more interesting topics to think about. So this is the task, the mission of culture. We have to be distant from these common people who compose the Polish government. We have 3 minutes left, so I would like to ask you about another important topic in your art. I would like to ask you about music. What does music mean in the context of your poetry, and who is an important musician, composer for you? I'm an example of a very imperfect music listener. My hearing of music is very imperfect, but I do love music. Just like everyone else who loves it's like unreciprocated love. So it's like music is like a wavy imagination. It takes different forms. One of my Gustav Mahler is my favorite composer. He's not well known in Poland. It's not that he's not known in Poland, but I think that Poles do not know him sufficiently. Well, Chopin is also very close to my heart. What about the contemporary composers? Well, Shostakovich, a Russian great composer, Lutosławski. I am a bit conservative when it comes to my taste in music, also in terms of painting. I know that music is a living art, but somehow modern music has shrunk. 1 minute to go, so the last thing I would like to ask you about, what are you working on, and when are we going to see the results of your work? Krystyna Pielnicka of the A5 Publishers told me that she asked me whether I've got a new book, and I said, well, maybe I could have a new book because I wrote quite a lot of text about Józef Czapski. He's a real hero to me. I knew him quite well. I was honored. I was lucky enough to be friends with him. So he died many years ago, but I admire him even more. I become familiar with his painting. He was a universal man, and he was also a patriot. He was also on emigration. He created lots of works, and they become quite popular throughout the world. But it's not the reason why I want to write about him. I want to write about him because he's close to my heart. So it's a great conclusion because you used to travel with him to Lviv in your poems. So the time is up. Thank you very much for this discussion. I am sorry if I was trying to take you to the spaces that are not too comfortable for poets, but I was quite tempted. Well, I hope that you will be smiling a lot, stay hopeful, and I do wish that those who are now expressing themselves using 8 stars, I hope that they will read your poems and they start understanding your poetry. So I hope that they will create a new word. Of course, some things have to be demolished, but the foundation has to remain. So I would like to recommend Adamem Zagajewskim to you, a great poet. Thank you, Jarosław. Pilot Perks can land now. Houston, no problem. We have no problems. So thank you. Good night.